Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 476. My name is Minter Dial, and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on this network, please visit evergreenpodcasts.com. This week's interview is with David Gluckman. David is a self-described man of ideas. Author of the book, That Shit Will Never Sell. David is an original madman of the ad world. His ability to come up with singularly powerful ideas is legendary. In this conversation with David, we discuss his career, the remarkable brands he's created, his thought process, what brand managers and marketers could be doing to pierce through today's busy world. You'll find all the show notes on minterdart.com. And please, if you have a couple of moments, do drop in a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe so you can catch all the future episodes. Now for the show. David Gluckman, how lovely to have you on the show. I was introduced to you through Jake Shaw, and I got a chance to listen to you talk about your journey in branding and marketing. And really, David, well, first of all, you're a man with great ideas. You also are a man who have seen a whole lot of generations of marketers and branders. In your own words, David, how'd you like to describe yourself?
That's incredibly lucky. I mean, I managed to spend 36 years working up close and personal with an organization that became the largest of its kind. And I had a chance to observe the way it worked and find ways of making it work more effectively. I don't think it came to anything. It came to something in terms of the brands, but I'm not sure that the practices lived on.
Right. Well, I suppose in the end of the day, legacies are made in different ways, but having brands that have your stamp on the inside surely must be something that's rather pleasing.
It's very pleasing. I love, I'm still waiting to find somebody reading my book in an unexpected place. I think that would make my cup runneth over. Right.
Well, so anybody who is interested to read your book, it's called, and I suppose I don't have the bleep button on my screen, but That Shit Will Never Sell. Tell us about why you wrote that book, David.
Well, I think I had this unique opportunity. I've read a few business books and I've looked at the perspectives, and many of them are about erudite academics talking about ideas and how they happen, or others are about autobiographers writing about other people who had ideas. And mine is a cold-faced perspective about the business of ideas. Somebody comes to you and says, I have a problem. Can you solve it? And the book is about the mechanisms of solving a problem. And there's no magic method. There's no particular system. The particular system is that you have to be obsessed with the problem for 168 hours per week. You have to go to sleep worrying about it, and you have to wake up enthusing about it. And it's no more than that. I think we were having a conversation with that young lady, and she said, what's your method for coming up with ideas? And I think my answer was panic. It's a fear of, and I also created a rod for my back fairly early on by coming to terms with the fact that you can only go back to somebody with a single solution to a problem. It's incredibly easy to come up with 6 answers to a brief. I can do that in an hour to most briefs. But to come up with something that you genuinely believe is the best possible answer you can come up with is quite a tough assignment. This is the idea. This is the one. This is my dogma, if you like. And that's what the book's about. It's how I came up with these particular answers.
When I listen to you, it makes me think of Don from Mad Men. that he would have that sort of conviction on the idea and the balls to sort of say, well, this is it. This is the singular idea, and let me show you why. Because it's very difficult when you're presenting creative ideas to not feel somewhat awkward or vulnerable, because it's a creation that comes out of you. And there's always a risk that someone sort of kiboshes it, and you feel like it's a blow to the personal ego.
Yes, I think that again, a system evolved, which I think was incredibly successful, and I don't think has been replicated, certainly within Diageo. And that was that the most important part of the process for me was establishing a wavelength with the person who commissioned the idea, so that eventually the ownership of the idea became a joint thing. There were two of you working on this thing. You both had the same understanding of the difficulty of it, so that when the answer came, you could sell it off the back of a cigarette packet because it was that, and both people then understood it. And it was achieved in a couple of ways, really. One is we never had a successful idea that went through middle management. Never. Not one idea in 36 years went to market based on an interface with middle management, because middle management doesn't have the confidence to buy an idea. Middle management, there are very few people who would you present an idea to and they'd say, hey, that's absolutely it. We're going to do it now. So all the relationship was with top management, and top management, recognizes that you're going to fail from time to time. And they can live with that, whereas middle management can't, because it's a severe impediment to career development. So top management can afford, and also top management isn't equipped with all the, I think, extremely suspect tools that people use to evaluate ideas. I remember presenting an idea to someone who I thought was top management, but had a middle management mentality. I got very excited by the idea. I put it down on the table and I said, that's as good as you'll get, and that's as good as I can offer. And the response was, well, where are the other ideas? So I said, beg your pardon? She said, where are the other 4 or 5 ideas against which I can evaluate this? And I said, I haven't done that kind of thing for 28 years, I'm afraid. So there aren't any other ones. Either you buy this or we start again somewhere. And she was a top manager with a middle management mentality. So, and I think these views are quite radical, I think, in the context of modern marketing. Certainly, I come across those problems. Why can't you test ideas against each other? I think the biggest single waste of corporate finance goes in testing alternatives. Testing alternative packs, names, products, positionings, all that kind of thing. I mean, people use market research as an excuse for taking decisions or expressing their understanding of a business. As an outside consultant, getting a brief to develop a new brand, you have about 2 weeks to understand the business before you come up with a solution, or you have a month or so to come up with a solution. And that should be enough. I mean, people who work in the business for long periods of time should behave as if they understand that business and not go and ask a bunch of uncommitted, unqualified people to make a decision. You get along with four products, and you say to some person who doesn't give a damn about the products and is getting paid £25 to come along and shoot their mouth off, which one of these do you like best? And those people are going to say, well, I like best the one that I'm most familiar with, because consumers like what they know. They don't really know what they like. So if I were running a big company, that one of the first things I'd look at is the market research budget. And I'd cut it in half, and then I'd cut it in half again, because I think people waste huge amounts of money on something that's utterly ineffectual. It cannot underwrite success, and it cannot offset failure. And yet we spend trillions on market research worldwide. It's crazy.
Right, there's a lot to unpack in that, David. So first of all, I want to just lean back into this notion of senior management versus middle management. So what I heard you say was that a senior management mindset, first of all, has the courage to base or to decide on one option without needing to have contingencies or variations against which to measure the first one. The second thing I heard you say is that they are prepared to accept the idea of failure. Would that be the fair description of what you consider as a senior management mindset?
I think so. They're not bothered with the nitty-gritty of the detail and the analysis that goes into the development of brands. With Baileys, for example, a middle manager would have said, well, why are we calling it Baileys? It's Irish. So therefore we test Baileys against O'Reilly's, against Michael Henneys, against this one and that one. Just completely pointless and a complete waste of time. The manager who saw it, because we printed it on the bottle, and he was in Ireland, looked at it and said, yeah, Baileys, perfect. Well, let's do it. There was no debate about that. And middle management has to debate every single aspect of something, whereas the top manager says, okay, look at you, I trust you, let's do it. And we do. And the other thing, which I think is that if you are going to fail cheaply. Now, if you worked in a big company like L'Oreal, which had probably a lot of methodology and systems and stage gates and stuff like that, you can spend £1 million before you even begin, in researching and in evaluating and over-intellectualizing stuff that, P&G, I think, kept me honest and said, basically, you're in the business of selling stuff to people in shops. It's not some great neuroscientific journey. It's a pretty pragmatic experience.
This idea of overthinking. On the one hand, I'm thinking of stories that I can remember where, as a middle manager presenting an idea, you might want to say, well, this was presented by such and such an agency, or the consultancy is called McKinsey or IBM or something very well known. So brand name helps to justify what I do, as opposed to coming in with some sort of no-name person. Who is he to present to us this big brand?
Well, I was lucky. I was basically one guy for most of my career. I had a partner for a bit, but most of my time was spent as a single person. And I didn't have any big credibility like McKinsey have or anybody else. And I remember doing a project for a very large company. And unbeknownst to me, they employed an American, a kind of global, Paris, London, New York, Shanghai, offices everywhere to work in parallel with me. So they saw all my stuff, but I only unofficially saw all their stuff. And it was absolute crap. It was really substandard rubbish. And they were paid £1 million, and I think I was paid about 1/8 of that. So it was good money for me, but
sure. But silly money to spend on.
Yeah.
The other thing that you talked about, David, and certainly I'm really interested to sort of understand how that goes down for people who are listening. The brief. There's the content of the brief, and then there's the deliverer of the brief. And what I was hearing from you before was that much of what you thought was allowed for your success was the understanding of the person delivering the brief as well, not just the words on the paper. Describe to me, or maybe, unpick a little bit that idea, just what is a good brief, and how much is it really dependent on your understanding of the business and the person?
Well, the most successful brand we ever developed came from possibly what I call the brief from hell. Simply because the brief started with the Irish finance minister, who introduced legislation which gave a company a 10-year tax holiday if they developed a brand primarily for export. The brief then passed from him to the head of the Irish company. It then went from the head of the Irish company to the head of head office in London, who then passed it down to their man in London, who passed it down to me. And basically, the brief was, the Irish want a new brand for export. Period. That was it. The Irish want a new brand for export. They didn't say, well, the MD is particularly loves cognac, or so-and-so particularly likes this or that, or anything else. The Irish want a new brand for export.
And this is now we were in the drink space.
We're in the drink space. And
at least they gave that parameter.
Yes. And we're talking about 1973. So this is the brief. It lands on my desk. The Irish, whom we never met until the day of the presentation, want a brand for export. And that was absolutely it. And the idea ended up as Bailey's, and the idea came from my experience a decade earlier in developing the branding for Irish butter and Irish dairy produce, working with a very famous man called A.J.F. O'Reilly, who later became president of Heinz and other things.
Indeed.
But the agency created Kerrygold as the brand. And I remember saying to my partner 10 years later, is there anything in my Kerrygold experience that will help us solve this brief? And he said, well, what happens if you mix Irish whiskey and Irish cream? So being a man of action, we went down to a local store, bought some cream, bought some whiskey, added them together. They tasted disgusting. Went back to the store, found some Cadbury's drinking chocolate, added some sugar, mixed it until we arrived at something we rather liked, but had no idea what proportions we'd used. And then I called up my client and said, look, I think we've got something really interesting here. And here now lies the key point in all of this. He said, what a great idea, let's do it. And I mean, I think that it was that day that I learned that the buyer was much more important than the seller when it comes to ideas. People who have the ability to buy an idea are like gold dust in an organization. Because he could easily have said, well, that's not really our thing. And I would have had to go back to the drawing board, but he didn't. He said it was terrific. And I said, can you make it? And this is my ignorance beginning to work, because it does. If you don't, as I said in my talk, I think if you don't know what you can't do, then the opportunities are endless. And so there was a lot of learning there, I think, in that process, which was 50 years ago, which is amazing, really. And that was right at the beginning of my career. And that those were hardwired lessons that I learned.
Well, so thinking of it from this buyer's perspective, the man or woman who has the courage to say, I love that idea.
Mm-hmm.
How does one develop that? There's an instinct element. There's I buy the man's ideas, your ideas. I like you, the way you express it, the confidence that you exude. How does one come up with, or is it complete knowledge of the market that says, all right,
no, nothing. I think it was basically friendship. By the time, I had been working with this guy for 3 years. We'd won a few minor ones, we'd lost a few minor ones, and we were friends. I mean, we talked. When we sat down for lunch, which was often, we just talked about the business and problems and everything. So we were two people who belonged to the same mindset. And I come from advertising, which was quite a confrontational business by comparison. You know, what is the agency's viewpoint? You always thought there was an element of threat in a relationship with the client. But this guy was a friend of mine. He was, you know, we did social things together. And I went on holiday with his family a couple of times. So and I think that kind of friendly relationship, there was no fear. I wasn't in the slightest bit afraid of presenting an idea to him. And I think that was really important. And that happened throughout my career, give or take. And it was brilliant.
Because there's a feeling of friendship, but then there's also going to be a feeling of you've got my back. You're not going to present to me something that would torpedo my career, because we hang out, we trust each other, we speak the same language.
Well, the other thing about it is you keep the expenditure down. You know, you don't, in a sense, for most of my career, I operated under the radar. Not many people knew I was, but we read a book in the 70s by Tom Peters called In Search of Excellence, and he suggested the notion of brand champions within companies. And IDV, which was Diageo before it became Diageo, came up with the notion that people at the top level of the organization should champion brands. So I get the finance director would call me in and say, well, I want to do a brand in this particular area. And say, fine, you're the boss. So what do you want to do? Now, he didn't know anything about marketing, which is another dirty word in all this, I think. But not going through the marketing route also helped, because marketing overthinks everything. Everything about marketing is about. And I think if you're trying to develop new ideas, marketing is great at marketing, but it's not very good at coming up with new ideas. So if you're dealing with a finance director, it's a very different game.
I have a lovely friend who worked at Diageo, so I'll have to ping him on that thought. So your career, David, has really, you were part of the Mad Men era. Did you watch Mad Men, by the way? Did you
Absolutely,
like it?
every episode.
Yeah, did you like it? I guess you liked it.
Yeah. No. I mean, I didn't quite identify with Don. I think I probably smoked as much as he did. That was about it.
It's shocking these days to see that much smoking going on inside. Those days existed. But in your career, David, how would you say, if at all, how would you describe the evolution of branding as it's come today? Do you see shifts, or do you think it's overdone? We should go back to where we were. What do you think of the evolution of branding?
Well, I think from where I sit, that it's become very overthought. That we have new animals who come into business who didn't exist in my time. We have people like brand planners. We never had brand planners back in my time, and brand strategists. It was much simpler when I started. I mean, I started in advertising as account executive. And I realized after a couple of years that I'd made a terrible mistake. And I got to 30 and I had a family. And I couldn't afford to say, well, look, I really should have been a copywriter, because I would have had to start at the bottom. I had no record. So what I did was try to invent a new career for myself. And I said, well, why don't we set up a department to develop new brands? Because I figured I could do all the things that copywriters did and more, and that would be fun. And luckily, I had a boss who bought it.
Again, a boss who was able to decide. Again, a boss who was able to decide. Go for it.
Yeah, let's set up a department to develop new brands. The trends in advertising with the development of ancillary services, like research units and design departments and stuff. So why not a new product company.
I'm Anne-Marie Kelly. Wild Precious Life is a podcast about dreaming big, digging in and connecting across distance, division, and loss. In each episode, I talk with prize-winning writers, musicians, and wanderers who remind all of us how we can make the most of the time we have. So meet me here. Let's walk and talk and dream and discover what it means to be wild, precious, and brave.
So how would you describe the state of branding today? It's overwrought, it's overthought. Do you see any difference in the way branding should be? What advice would you give to people who are branding, aside from reading your book, of course? But what would you tell them to do?
Simplify. Make it smaller. When I worked for IDV for all those years, we had a tiny unit. There were a couple of us who would go off to Korea and develop a brand for the Koreans, go off to Japan and work with the Japanese. Now they have kind of what they call innovation hubs all over the world, full of people who aren't innovating. I mean, I got really quite surprised when somebody used the word innovation about 25 times in an article describing the development of a pomegranate-flavored vodka. And to me, that isn't innovation. That's something you can do in 2 hours on a Friday afternoon. You really don't call that innovation, and go out and do massive research across the world to determine whether the world wants it. It's complete bullshit.
So simplify.
Simplify and reduce.
So another concept that you talk about, David, which I thought was very interesting, is what you call inside the box thinking. And, I would suppose that all these marketers, I mean, I must finger point myself as a marketer. That's how I sort of grew up through the L'Oreal ranks. We would always talk about outside the box. And I love the freshness of this idea of inside the box. Explain to us what is inside the box thinking.
I thought you might ask that. So I dug out a quote, which I think if I do have a gravestone, it might have this quote on it. And it's written by a pair of academics called Richard Farson and Ralph Keyes, who wrote a book called The Best Ideas Aren't Hit. We called Whoever Makes the Most Mistakes Wins. And I don't think, I've never heard anybody else mention the book, but in it they say, the best ideas aren't hidden in shadowy recesses. They're right in front of us, hidden in plain sight. Innovation seldom depends on discovering obscure or subtle elements, but in seeing the obvious with fresh eyes. And I thought that was a very wise. That was a wise chronicle of everything that I remembered in my career. And I remember people, friends of mine, I used to play in this pub cricket team, and they'd say, and I'd show them a new idea, and they'd say, "Did you get paid to come up with this?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" Well, they said, "It's so damned obvious. I could have thought of it." And I said, "Yes, of course you could have." And I mean, I think to me, that was the real thrill of everything that I did, was coming up with something that was so obvious that anybody could have thought of it. It just...
Once you've had the thought, it becomes obvious, but until you actually crystallize it, it stays right out there in thin air. So I love the idea.
There was an idea that didn't make it, but I was incredibly proud of it. I got an email which had an incredibly boring piece of legislative information about wine. And in it, it said that in order to be classified as a varietal wine, the product must have at least 80% of the named varietal. So in other words, to call something Chardonnay, it has to have 80% Chardonnay. And then I suddenly thought, well, what about the other 20? You know, you could actually add anything to Chardonnay, but if it's got 80% Chardonnay, you could still call it that. So I said, why don't we mix Chardonnay with a red wine and produce the world's first red Chardonnay? If you blend it with Cabernet Sauvignon, you could have red Chardonnay. And that's a communication of an idea, which is so incredibly simple. I couldn't get the wine people interested enough in it, but I thought it was a great idea. And that's not outside the box. That's right in the middle of the box. And
you talk about this idea of failing fast, fail a lot. And the other thing that comes to my mind as I listen to you, David, is the ideas sometimes come by mistake. So what I'm thinking about in the pharmaceutical area is how many drugs arrive while you're testing for one thing, something else happens.
Yeah.
And you have to have that openness to be willing to, or, check it out in the way it happens, to be observing, having great eyes and observation. Would you say that's part of the skill of being inside the box?
Well, it's part of it. I think it's also, there've got to be some advantages for being as old as me. But by being as old as me and maybe remaining compos mentis, my memory span goes back a hell of a long time. My sentience started in the 1940s. And there was one idea that I had that actually went back to my dad's liquor cabinet in circa 1947. And I remembered something in there, which I was then reminded of somewhere else. And it all came together to produce an idea. And I think that it's that kind of memory that it was very helpful. I also had an incredibly peculiar education. When I went to university, I studied 3 years of English, 3 years of psychology concurrently, history of art, history of music, constitutional law, philosophy, and Latin. So I've got a lot of sort of books to draw on, which again is turned out, it's a pretty useless degree in terms of taking me anywhere specific, but it was incredibly valuable in filling my mind with, it's great for pub quiz machines.
Amongst other things.
Amongst other things.
Yeah, it's for me, it's a mark of curiosity to wish to explore so many different subjects. Would you agree?
Well, it was just part of the degree course in South Africa. That you had to do 10 courses, 2 majors of 3 years each, etc., and fill the rest up with whatever you wanted.
Well, I certainly subscribe to that kind of a mindset. I think in today's world, I like to call it the comb mentality, or the comb skill set, where it's a comb with many teeth, none of them particularly deep, but it's the combination of the teeth, each tooth representing an area that allows you to sort of bring in new ideas and have sort of mental gymnastics to come up with cool thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice analogy.
So when you are looking at brands and all the brands that you've created in your path, is there one that just sits as your little sweetheart in all this? I'd love to hear that.
There are a few. I think one of them was, I sort of alluded to earlier, it was the one where I was required to offer options. We were given a brief back in 2002 by a sales director, I think, who said he wanted to develop a brand to compete with Red Bull, which is pretty tough at the time. And you had all this kind of wonderful observations about Red Bull tasted disgusting, the formula was illegal, etc., etc. But it was pretty tough to compete with it. And I came to a simple conclusion. I said to myself, well, the secret of competing with mega brands like that is not to compete with all of it, compete with some of it. So I've got a line which is, if you're going after a giant, aim for the ankles, not for the heart, because it's easy to do that. And in this particular case, I said, why don't we develop a drink that is directed towards stimulating only mental energy? Red Bull was all about overall energy, physical, mental, gives you wings, that kind of thing. Let's produce the world's first drink designed to give you mental energy. And I was very excited by this. And I did some trawling on the internet and found something called nootropics. Do you know about that?
Nope.
Well, nootropics are sort of proprietary drugs that you could buy in supermarkets, in pharmacies, that were claimed to stimulate your mental energy. So I thought we'll produce the world's first nootropic drink designed to give you mental energy. And I came up with, I was very happy with the brand name. I called it IQ. And it was the think drink. And I had this vision in my head that we would persuade Garry Kasparov, who was then world chess champion, to sponsor us, or endorse the brand and show it every time he was seen playing chess with a bottle of IQ. I'll show you the package, which I particularly liked. The designer did this is a sort of hole-in-one idea. And as soon as he showed it to me, I said, that's absolutely what it should be.
Oh gosh, it's very cute. Well,
that was a number of years before the Minions.
Right, I would love it. So I'll take a screen grab of that, and then I will add that into the show notes so people can actually see what you're talking about.
There was a second one which I absolutely adored, and again, that wasn't successful. When Diageo was formed, there was a lot of kind of hands across the sea activity between Guinness UD and IDV. They were looking at the synergies that coming together would bring. And one of the areas that emerged was the possibility of developing a Guinness whiskey. And there was a lot of talk which went on for about 6 months, of which I was not party to in any way. And then somebody said to me, look, these people are just not doing anything. Why don't you go along and see if you can get things moving a bit? And they talked about whether it should be Irish or Scots, which I thought was a pretty no-brainer, because Guinness is just something that you breathe in when you get off the plane at Dublin Airport.
You certainly do.
It has to be Irish. But I mean, one of the problems with Guinness being Irish whiskey at that time was that all the Irish whiskey was controlled not by Diageo, but by Pernod Ricard. So if they had made it hugely successful, Guinness whiskey from Ireland, it would have taken business from their Scotch. And that would also, be could be held to ransom by Pernod Ricard on whiskey price, etc. And then I have this extraordinary kind of memory. It's about remembering something that somebody said once. And I remember going around a distillery, something I really found quite boring after I'd done the first one. And somebody said, well, first we make a beer and then we make a whiskey. And that stuck in my head. So the first phase in making a whiskey is making a fermented product, which is a beer. And then I thought, well, that's it. Why don't we simply take Guinness and distill it? That's all. So, and what would we call it? We wouldn't call it Guinness whiskey because it wouldn't be whiskey. We'd call it distilled Guinness because that's what it would be. And the beauty of that would be, there were several advantages of that. One, you could make it taste anything, any way you wanted. There was no law as to what it should taste like. So you could determine what it tastes like. You were not going to be held to ransom by the Irish Whiskey Association or the Scotch Whisky Association.
Right, because it's a different category.
Geographically, your provenance, there was no geographical consideration. In other words, if you made Guinness in Singapore, you could distill Guinness in Singapore because its provenance was not a country, but a brand. And I cannot tell you how excited I was by that insight. And in fact, I jumped in my car and drove into Covent Garden to meet my designer friend, the same guy who did IQ. And we sat down at his office and designed the bottle, and which I'll show you here. I'll send you better pictures than you.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Yeah, I'd love to. I'm being a Guinness fan. I see myself in that drink right away.
That's distilled Guinness, basically. And I actually made the product. I got some Johnny Walker. There's some J&B because it's a soft, sweet whiskey. I added some Jack Daniels to give it a bit of guts. I then put some caramel to make it black. And I was in Dublin a week later doing a couple of focus groups called My Goodness Distilled Guinness. And the other thing, while we were designing the bottle, we suddenly realized that, of course, people might think it's a beer. So we made the 40%
big enough.
Massive,
right, absolutely.
So that people knew it wouldn't be a beer. And I remember presenting this on my 60th birthday, and I was so excited by it. And it never happened. Do it tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe someone's listening. When you're presenting these types of ideas, the fact that you presented only one idea, the fact that you had a backbone, you were obsessed by the problem and really dug into it, and also developed a relationship with the briefer. Would that be a good resume of the types of things that you developed to make it successful when you were proposing ideas, notwithstanding the fact that you just talked about, let's say, one that didn't work, but on balance, for someone who's listening and they're trying to propose an idea and they want to sort of attach themselves a little bit to your success and your mojo, would you describe it that way?
I think it is relationships, friendships, shared problems, really. If you both understand the problem in the same way, then there was a brand called Aqua Libra. I don't know if you remember it. It was in the 80s. It was a very successful brand in the 80s. And the guy that was my opposite was the global marketing director of the company, a man called Tim Ambler, who became a professor at London Business School. And Tim and I, we just talked about this thing for about 3 months on and off. And then I had the idea and I called him up, and fortunately he was in. I said, I sold it to him in 2 minutes because we both knew what the problem was, so we knew what the solution would be. Nowadays it's in, show me these 6 ideas and tell me what you think.
I have this lasting impression, David, as I listen to you both in that story with the Guinness 40% and with the Bailey's story, just how much of a smile you must have had as you were concocting these things, tasting them, and sometimes getting a little buzz, I'm sure, on the way. But you obviously were a little bit of a chemist as well. It feels
nothing could be further from the truth.
Oh, there you go.
Nothing could be. I mean, I developed. Do you remember the Piat d'Or?
Yes, I do.
Which the French never did adore, but with the Piat d'Or, in order to brief the French winemaker, I got some Blue Nun and mixed it with red food coloring. And we took to the French wine and said, can you make a French wine that tastes like that? Because that's what the brief is. And he said, well, what is it? And I said, never you mind. That's what you have to achieve. That's the result. That's not the, what's in it it's got nothing to do with it.
I love it.
And then I definitely wasn't a chemist. I'm scientifically severely challenged.
But clearly successful, David. So David, how can people obviously get your book, follow you, listen to what you write and tweet, because I know you've been blogging as well? What's the best way to connect with you?
Well, my email address is david@tswns.net. So I'm always open to talking to people. They could read my book, which is That Shit Will Never Sell, which you can buy on Amazon. They can read my sort of éminence terrible stuff on LinkedIn, because I like stirring up controversy, I suppose.
And telling good stories.
Yeah. You never asked me where the title from my book came. So
I didn't.
I'll answer the question. The CEO of IDV took a couple of bottles of Bailey's to New York in early 1975, and he showed them to one of the titans of the industry, a man called Abe Rosenberg, who made J&B into the biggest selling whiskey in America. And he looked at it. He said that the original pack reminded him of Vietnam fatigues because of the color. It was a rather muddy khaki color. And he tasted it and turned to Anthony Tennant and said, "That shit will never sell." And since my book was self-published, I was looking for a title that would be attract attention. And I also thought that the guy who designed the cover for me did a fantastic job, because that's what it looks like when your grandmother comes to visit. But that's what it actually looks like.
I love it. That is a great play. Looks sexy on the outside, and then what do you say? It has double meaning, if you will.
Well, the great thing about that was I'd never met the designer, and I went along to brief him, and he pulled this thing out, with nothing inside, because I wanted to do the cover before I wrote the book, because I wanted the cover to give me a kind of tone of voice, and I hope I succeeded.
And to sell.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. I appreciate that Jake put us in touch. I loved hearing your stories. I would encourage everybody to go check out your book. I think we do need to think differently about the way we do branding these days. And I think your advice about making things simpler in the marketing world seems to resonate with me. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust is the reason. Still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust in my reason and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man here in these confines. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, put to the test. I'm a convinced man. I'm ready for an arrest. I'm a convinced man in the arms of a woman.
Anne-Marie Kelly. Wild Precious Life is a podcast about dreaming big, digging in and connecting across distance, division, and loss. In each episode, I talk with prize-winning writers, musicians, and wanderers who remind all of us how we can make the most of the time we have. So meet me here. Let's walk and talk and dream and discover what it means to be wild, precious, and brave.